Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 21, Leading the Way, the Progressive Movement, 1890 to 1920. Next slide. Here's an overview of the chapter. Next slide. First heading is entitled Origin of the Progressive Spirit in America. In its first decade, the Progressive era was a grassroots effort that ushered in reforms at state and local levels. Next slide. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, progressive endeavors captured the attention of the federal government. Next slide. The challenges of the late 19th century were numerous. Fast-growing cities were ill-equipped to house the working poor. Next slide. Hands-off politicians were shackled into impotence by their systems of political favors. Next slide. Rural Americans struggled to keep their farms afloat. Next slide. The muckraking journalists of the era published books and articles highlighting the social inequalities of the day and extolling everyday Americans to help find solutions. Next slide. Educated middle-class Anglo-Saxon Protestants dominated the movement, but progressives were not a homogeneous group. Next slide. The movement counted African Americans, both women and men, and urban as well as rural dwellers among its ranks. Progressive causes ranged from anti-liquor campaigns to fair pay. Next slide. Together, progressives sought to advance the spread of democracy, improve efficiency in government and industry, and promote social justice. Next slide. The second heading in the chapter is entitled Progressives at the Grassroots Level. Progressive campaigns stretched from the hurricane-ruined townships of Texas to the slums of New York, from the factory floor to the saloon door. Next slide. What tied together these disparate causes and groups was the belief that the country was in dire need of reform. Next slide. Answers to societal ills were to be found within the activism and expertise of predominantly middle-class Americans on behalf of troubled communities. Next slide. Some efforts, such as the National Child Labor Committee, pushed for federal legislation. However, most progressive initiatives took place at the state and local levels. Next slide. At the beginning of the 20th century, a more radical, revolutionary breed of progressivism began to evolve. Next slide. While these radical progressives generally shared the goals of their more mainstream counterpart, their strategies differed significantly. Next slide. Mainstream progressives and many middle-class Americans feared groups such as the Socialist Party of America and the Industrial Workers of the World, which emphasized workers' empowerment and direct action. Next slide. The progressives' commitment to promote, new heading, New Voices for Women and African Americans. The progressive commitment to promoting democracy and social justice created an environment within which the movements for women's rights and African American rights grew and flourished. Next slide. Emergent leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Alice Paul spread the cause of women's suffrage. Next slide. African Americans, guided by leaders such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, strove for civil rights and economic opportunity, although their philosophies and strategies differed significantly. Next slide. In the women's and civil rights movements alike, activists both advanced their own causes and paved the way for later efforts aimed at expanding equal opportunity and citizenship. The last heading of this section is entitled Progressivism in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt became president by a historical accident, that is, the assassination of William McKinley, but his activism in the executive branch spoke to the progressive spirit in the nation and transformed the president's office for the 20th century. Next slide. The courage he displayed in his confrontation with big business, and willingness to side with workers in capital labor disputes, as well as his commitment to the preservation of federal lands, set an agenda his successors had to match. Next slide. Like Roosevelt, William Howard Taft pushed antitrust rulings and expanded federal oversight of interstate commerce. Next slide. But estrangement from his predecessor and mentor left Taft in a difficult position for re-election. Next slide. Roosevelt's third-party challenge as a progressive split the Republican vote and handed Woodrow Wilson the presidency in 1912. Next slide. A progressive like his predecessor, Wilson was also a political creature who understood the need to do more in order to ensure his re-election. Next slide. He too sought to limit the power of big businesses and stabilize the economy, and he ushered in a wave of progressive legislation that grassroots progressives had long called for. Next slide. The nation's entanglement in World War I, however, soon shunted the progressive goals of democracy, efficiency, regulation, and social justice to the back burner. Next slide. The nation's new priorities included national security and making the world, quote, safe for democracy, end quote. And that's it for chapter 21.